If you care about how ordinary people were expected to survive extraordinary events, you're in the right place. Now, before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who takes history and preparedness seriously, because what we're about to cover isn't nostalgia or trivia. It's practical knowledge drawn from an era when governments openly planned for cities to lose water overnight, and civilians were expected to adapt fast or suffer the consequences. During the Cold War, urban water scarcity was not a hypothetical problem. It was a certainty built into nuclear war planning. Power stations would be destroyed, pumping stations disabled, reservoirs contaminated, and municipal systems rendered useless in hours. Civil defense planners understood that thirst, sanitation collapse, and fire suppression failure would kill more civilians than blast effects in many scenarios. What's often forgotten is how detailed and practical civilian drills around water actually were, and how relevant they remain today in a world facing infrastructure failure, cyber sabotage, and climate-driven disruption. Why Cold War planners treated water as the first urban survival priority. Cold War civil defense documents consistently ranked water alongside shelter and medical care as a primary survival need. This wasn't theoretical. Studies conducted in the 1950s and 60s showed that even intact cities became unlivable within days if water pressure dropped. High-rise buildings were especially vulnerable because electric pumps were required to move water upward. Once power failed, entire neighborhoods were dry. Civilian drills emphasized decentralization. Households were expected to store water independently rather than rely on emergency distribution. Authorities assumed that organized relief might not arrive for weeks. This thinking came from hard lessons learned during World War II bombing campaigns and was formalized under agencies like the Federal Civil Defense Administration, which produced manuals explicitly telling citizens not to expect rescue. During those tense times, civilians were, trained to store water even inside the most crowded cities. Urban residents were encouraged to think vertically and get a bit creative. Bathtubs, for example, weren't just for keeping clean, they doubled as emergency reservoirs. Drills would actually encourage families to fill their tubs right after hearing warning sirens, well before any impact might occur. People repurposed containers from everyday life. Glass jars, enamel pots, even rubbish bins lined with plastic were all considered acceptable, so long as they were cleaned properly. The key instruction, really, was all about rotation and protection. Stored water needed to be sealed up tight to keep out dust and fallout particles. Manuals made it clear. Water stored before an attack was always safer than anything you might collect afterward. And, honestly, that's still true today. If you live in a modern flat, you can pre-store water in your bathtub using cheap liners, rotate your bottled supplies every 6 months, and keep them away from sunlight and chemicals. The principle, well, it hasn't changed, just the packaging. So, what did those Cold War drills teach about finding water when the system failed? Civil defense training never assumed storage alone would be enough. Folks were taught to spot alternative sources right there in the city. Hot water tanks, for instance, were highlighted as one of the most reliable hidden reserves. A standard residential heater could hold enough drinkable water to keep a family going for several days, as long as it was drained properly. Rainwater collection was also addressed, even in cities. Residents were instructed to use rooftops, window awnings, and improvised gutters to channel rain into clean containers, then filter and boil it. This wasn't survivalist fantasy. It was a sanctioned practice included in official guidance. Today, the same method applies using modern filters and heat sources like camp stoves or solar boilers. How purification was simplified for civilians under stress. Cold War planners understood cognitive overload. Instructions were intentionally simple. Boiling was emphasized because it required no chemicals and worked against biological contamination. Chemical purification tablets were recommended, but always as a secondary method due to dosage errors under stress. The takeaway for modern viewers is discipline. Boil when possible, filter debris first, and store treated water separately from untreated sources. These steps are not complicated, but they require rehearsal. Civilian drills existed because people perform better under pressure when they practice calmly beforehand. Now, when water disappeared, addressing sanitation failure became absolutely critical. One of the most overlooked aspects of Cold War water drills was, honestly, waste management. Authorities understood that disease would spread rapidly if toilets became unusable. So, households were instructed to switch over to dry sanitation methods, using buckets, liners, and absorbent materials. Waste was to be sealed and stored well away from living spaces. This is, admittedly, uncomfortable history, but it's essential to understand. Modern urban residents can actually apply the same principles, using portable toilets, heavy-duty bags, and designated storage areas. The real lesson here isn't to improvise at the last minute, but to pre-plan exactly where waste goes when water no longer flows. And then there's the matter of fire risk, which frankly drove some of the most extreme water conservation measures. Urban fires terrified Cold War planners even more than radiation in certain scenarios. With water pressure gone, fires could spread totally unchecked. Civilians were trained to conserve every drop, not just for drinking, but also for fire suppression. Buckets of grey water were stored specifically for extinguishing small fires before they had a chance to spread. You know, this mindset really does apply today in any grid-down urban emergency. It's important to keep separate reserves for hydration and fire control, just in case. Never assume emergency services will arrive, because, well, sometimes they simply can't. Back in the Cold War, those drills conditioned civilians to act immediately, not just wait around for instructions. Now, let's talk about how these drills, translate directly into modern preparedness. The relevance is, well, uncomfortable, but honestly, it's undeniable. Cyber attacks, infrastructure decay and climate stress can cripple urban water systems without a single missile ever being launched. The Cold War approach, it treated civilians as active participants in survival, not just passive victims. That philosophy, I think, is truly worth reviving. So, start by auditing your living space. Take a look around and figure out just how much water you can store without attracting attention or, creating any hazards. Learn how to drain your hot water tank safely. It's a handy skill. Practice some basic purification methods too. And don't forget to design a sanitation fallback plan. None of this really requires paranoia. It just requires respect for history. Cold War civilian drills, they weren't about fear, not really. They were about continuity. The assumption was that life would go on, but only if people understood the systems they depended on, and how to replace them when they failed. If this kind of deep, practical history matters to you, do consider subscribing to the channel and maybe share this guide with someone who thinks preparedness is just a modern invention. The past has already solved many of the problems we pretend are new, and this channel exists to make sure that knowledge isn't lost again.